Hello, I'm Dr. Kimberly Douglas, and I am the chief contributor to the Substack, The Learning Landscape, where we are mapping 21st century learning, mainly for adults, but 21st century learning. Welcome. Thank you for being here. In the Substack or through the Substack, I am laying out all the places in the virtual and actual landscape where learning is taking place. And one of my main objectives for doing this is to demonstrate that learning is happening in so many places outside of formal and traditional institutions. Formal and traditional institutions are part of the landscape, but they're one part of the landscape. So I want us to see the whole picture. So when we start to do things like say that a certain group of people is illiterate or that children are failing and you're not learning this or you're not learning that, a need for us to pause for a moment and take a breath and make sure we are actually portraying reality as it is. And we don't really know illiteracy or we don't really know what's failing and what's succeeding if we can't see the whole picture. And that's what I'm doing here in this Substack is laying out the whole picture, the whole map, to try to keep the metaphor the same, the whole map of this learning landscape. So a critical piece of this is where people are learning determines what they're learning, who can learn, what they have access to, etc. So we think about the learning landscape and the where. It's location. It's about location. Like the whole conversation is about location. Some of these locations include formal institutions. They may include certification programs, but they may also include podcasts because I talked about podcasts last week. They may include gaming communities. And this week, they may include social media. This week, I'm going to talk about gig work. Okay. So just take a beat for a moment and just really open our minds to, oh, wait a minute. We thought that this was just supposed to happen in K-12 or in trade school or community college or four-year colleges or four-year universities or in grad school or professional school or law school or medical school. That's where we thought that learning was supposed to happen. And it is happening there, but it's also happening in so many other places, and so many avenues have opened up to different people. So I want to talk about gig work this week, right? So when I talk about gig work, I'm talking about most of this platform based now, where you contract to do a specific type of work. So someone puts out a bid and says, "Hey, I'm looking for someone to write a curriculum vitae or resume." And then several people who are signed up with the app then jump on and based upon their credentials, make a bid to fulfill that service for that person. And for a variety of reasons, that person chooses one individual over another. And so that's gig work. And people may be applying to do gig work as individuals, but also there are companies that go onto platform and then they subcontract to get the gig work done. When I talk about gig work platforms, I'm talking about platforms such as FlexJobs, Upwork, Collabtree, and others. There are many, many other platforms that I can name, and you can go look up that list. There are all kinds. I'm going back and forth here on my computer, and if I just go in and I put in and I'll do this in real time, top 25 gig work apps. If I just go to Bing, put in the top 25 gig work apps, let's see what we get here. And this is 2025, and it's going to be different from year to year. So according to the Penny Hoarder, the best gig apps to make extra money in 2025. So it goes, of course, what do they do? So they can help deliver groceries, they can help provide all kinds of services. And it's like it's an alignment thing. So matching the person who has a specific set of skills with the person who needs someone who has those specific set of skills. So Upwork is the first one, Fiverr is the second one, And I'll just describe some of these, but I won't go into great detail because I don't want to lose the central point. So Upwork is a platform with a simple but important mission: connect skilled freelancers and clients for online work. Fiverr helps entrepreneurs and business owners find freelancers in industries. Hold on. To meet and collaborate. DoorDash, Amazon Flex, Uber, Lyft, Para, Instacart, Instawork, TaskRabbit, Thumbtack, and others, right? So some of these they offer creative labor, some offer manual labor, some offer like intellectual development, coaching, anything that mirrors, these sites mirror the needs in the general population. So I don't want to dwell on it too long because I don't want to lose the point. And the point is, for a lot of people who follow this Substack are educators or people who are doing educational development. I really need for us to see what the learning landscape is. And gig work or gig work apps, hiding in them is part of the learning landscape. So on the one hand, you have sites where you connect skills, people who have skills with people who need those skills or something from those skills. Within these sites are their own training centers or their information centers or what they would call a research centers, but there may not actually be research, but it's more like an archives or library center within these sites. And so they have their own educational kind of circulation desk within these sites. So they have the educational circulation desk, but they also have workshops and tutorials and demos and things that teach people how to function more effectively through the site. So they are not necessarily teaching specific tasks or specific, what am I trying to say, capabilities. They're teaching how to function best within the site, which in itself is an important skill set. Okay. So these gig work apps are occupying a very important space within the landscape because gig work is becoming more popular. I'm not going to give statistics on that. More and more apps coming into being. They're becoming more popular. And this is not an endorsement of gig work. This is not an endorsement of gig work. This is to say, within these apps, there are workshops, there are ebooks, there are tutorials, there are downloads. Like I have done some work on eWork, and so I get information about how to use what they call connects now, how to enhance the bidding process, all of these things to help me function more efficiently and more effectively inside of work. And then that's another thing I want to mention within these platforms. These platforms are now trying to do more gamification. And within the gamification process, there's an educational process there as well. So Upwork is using something called Connects, where so they're trying to monetize. They're trying to tier the monetization. So in addition to the money that they make from people seeking workers, so that's one way that they monetize. They also want to monetize through connects or bids or tokens or whatever through these various platforms want to connect through tokens and bids and connects. And so what the connects do or what the tokens do is they push you up in the rankings. So again, trying to monetize and trying to gamify the experience, but also in gamifying and in monetizing, there still is an informational exchange about how to leverage your account, how to position your account. So there's a whole education process within the app itself about how to push yourself up, how to make yourself more visible, how to leverage your account. Okay, so I want to talk about, again, always trying to situate these conversations within the learning landscape. And when I think about gig work, I immediately compare it to two things. So I compare it to traditional institutions and I compare it to temp agencies. So let's talk about traditional institutions to start with. With traditional institutions prepare people to work in industry based on my experience with accreditation. it is very important that institutions show to the accrediting agency that they are preparing students for industry. They have to demonstrate that they've talked to somebody in industry and they know that that the graduates that come from that program are able to occupy jobs in industry once they graduate. So it has to meet the needs of industry. So education, in this sense, is supporting industry, but it's removed from industry. So education is over here, and you graduate, and maybe in the process of matriculation, you're doing an internship or a practicum or whatever. So you become connected with industry, but it certainly is kind of like a delayed thing. So you go to school, you have the school experience, and then you go to industry. Okay, so that's the so there's a delay there in that relationship. So let's compare that to temp agency placement. So if you're working for a temp agency, a lot of times they do have in-house training that may teach you specific kinds of skills, like clerical skills or administrative skills, and maybe even other skills. But what they often have more of are skills development opportunities for how to function in the environment in which they are placing you. So in this situation with the temp agencies, you lead talking about the work. So where's the work? And then how do we make you fit into the work? There's something very similar happening in institutions. It kind of is being led by the work, but there's a delay there. So in between, you're at an institution, you're also learning subject matter. You're learning about particular things. You're learning certain skills that will be applied to the workplace later. With the temp and placement agency, it starts with here's the job. How do you fit the job? So all of the learning, all of the development comes with fitting a particular job that you can get right away. So I think about gig work, and it's kind of somewhere in between, but also looks a little bit, probably a little bit more like the temp agency work. With and let me go back and say that with the temp agencies, they may have their own in-house kind of library or in-house kind of archive or information center that you can borrow from to learn certain things. So they may have workshops, they may have opportunities for you to learn. So with gig work, and just thinking about this in comparison to institutions and thinking about it in comparison to temp agencies, many of the gig platforms are starting to have what they call research centers, but they may not necessarily be research centers, but like their search centers and their archives and their libraries, places where they have case studies. And they may be case studies about what's happening on the app, but access to case studies from maybe institutions, case studies, articles, blogs. So there's an educational arm connected to this gig work. Now, with the gig work, you are expected to bring certain credentials to that gig work. Same thing with the temp agencies. You're expected to bring certain credentials there, but you can also grow your credentials through the temp agency and also through the gig work. Usually with the gig work or the starting place for somebody who's trying to find work, like it starts. So the kind of work that I do, there are certain credentials that I have to have that are non-negotiable. If I am going in and saying, so like I have many years of experience doing institutional review board or IRB, which protects human participants in research. Know that it is unlikely that anything on Upwork or even Collabtree, where there are scientists, it is unlikely, or at least at this stage in their development, that they're going to give me that kind of development that I actually got in the real world. So what I'm doing in Collabtree and Upwork and apps like that, which are different from TaskRabbit and Uber and Lyft, what I'm doing is I'm bringing my professional credentials and their knowledge center inside of the app helps me leverage the credentials I already have. However, there is still a type of learning that is happening there because I have to learn to function within that particular part of the landscape. Okay, so even in Upwork and Collabtree, it's the experience is being led by the work. These people say they need these specific tasks or this specific, this particular kind of work done, and then I have to fit my credentials or see how my credentials and my ability to market myself. How does that fit within what they are looking for? And then what the platform does, what the app does, is it helps me figure out how do I take the credentials I already have and present that in a way that makes sense or that connects with the individual who's making a decision about who is going to be hired for this position. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is, yes, I may have the credentials, my credentials may fit exactly what the person is looking for, but the presentation is the important part, is an important part of the conversation. And within this app, there are educational tools, there are instruction guides, there are demos, there are conversations that are educating me on how to present in a certain way. So part of the learning landscape is, yes, traditional institutions. Yes, even inside temporary temp or agencies or placement agencies, there's a learning, part of the learning landscape is inside of those established organizations. But part of the learning landscape exists inside of the gig apps. And I'm saying this for those of us who are educators and those of us who pride ourselves on being part of adult learning and educational learning. We have to know where the learning is happening. There are opportunities for many of us to work with these platforms and become content developers for the platforms, or to post blog posts within the platforms, or to be a thought leader within the platforms. And so when we think about where we want to show up, where we want to make a difference, or where we can make a difference, we have to see the whole landscape. And I'll take a drink there and pause for a moment. With the shift that's coming from AI and other tools, people are going to be, those who are hiring are going to be looking for cheaper, more efficient, more effective ways to get things done. They're also looking for ways to reduce risk. And cost is one part of that risk. But they're going to be looking for other ways to reduce the risk of, and human interaction is a huge risk. It's a huge risk. And so it's very important that we understand the space that gig work is the space that gig work is operating in. I'm trying to find the right words within the landscape. That the more people are moving in that direction for a cheaper, more efficient, more effective, less riskier way to operate, the more knowledge is going to be shared in that context. When we think about the learning landscape, it is not enough to look at the things that are apparent to us. It is not enough to look at formal institutions. It's not even enough to look at temp agencies and placement services. It's not enough to look at trade schools and community colleges. That's not enough. It's not even enough to look at coaching programs, the independent coaching programs that are out here and things on Coursera and Udemy. There's a whole system that is existing within a system of gig apps. So just like we were talking about podcasts last week, there's kind of like a subscape of podcast. So you can think about the podcast as kind of like this subscape, its own little, pause here for a moment. So we think about the podcast as like its own little subscape there, where we can look inside and we can see certain conversations that are happening. We can see the certain ways that people are learning. We can see how information is being shared and how it's happening through relationship, how information is being disseminated through relationship and connection. So that's its own thing. We can do the same thing with gig work. If we're not including it in the conversation, we're missing a vital part of the conversation. So going back to the whole thing about relationship, it's relationship and its attention If people are coming to a gig work site to get work, then there's a certain way of relating that's already happening, and you've already captured, or you already have attracted, I'll say captured, you already have attracted people's attention. So you have their attention, and inside, if you're sharing blog posts, or if you're sharing articles, or if you're sharing case studies, then you've already attracted certain people's attention, and you've already attracted their attention, which means that they are primed to learn from you. And learning is happening in that space. And it is important for those of us to say that we are educators to understand what kind of learning is happening in that space. And most of the learning has to do with, or most of the learning that I've experienced has to do with how to leverage my skills and leverage my credentials on the site. But there could be a lot more. I haven't looked at every gig site because there are sites for music tutorials, music tutoring, all kinds of academic tutoring, all sorts of things. And so there's not only information and knowledge being transmitted there, but there are also lots of values being transmitted there as well. So this is very important to look at. I want to continue this conversation with you. And if you want to go deeper, so I've kind of skimmed the surface on this because my job here is to bring your attention. So my job here is to make the invisible visible, to make the connections that may not be apparent to us all, and just see how these things are coming together. So you think about, I don't know how much experience you have with like maps. It is the technology upon which the Google Maps is built. So when you look at a Google map, there are layers to that map. So one layer of the map, you're actually looking at multiple maps. So one layer may be, okay, this is the terrain. When I look at my Google map, I see the terrain. I can see what the physical landscape looks like. Another layer may have houses. I can see how houses are laid out on that map. Another layer may be zip code. So there's a zip code layer. Another layer may be income. It may be for a school district. So the different layers tell you different things. And I'm seeing the same thing for the learning landscape that I have in my head, which I'm slowly putting together an infographic on this that shows all these different layers. And I'm still conceptualizing that. But when I think about the learning landscape, it is traditional institutions, it's temp agencies and placement agencies, it is podcast, it is gaming, which we'll talk about gaming as well. It is social media, it is websites, it is broadcast channels, it is also gig work. You have to consider the role because there are educational centers inside the gig applications. I want to keep talking about this. I skimmed this at a very high surface level because the thing is to get you to thinking about this and talking about this. If you want to go deeper, and if you want to invite me to talk about this somewhere, I'm happy to talk about what I have been piecing together so far. You can go back through the Substack and you can see a history. You can kind of glean like how this conversation is coming together, but we can talk about it in a more formalized setting if you'd like to do that. But just keep thinking about this because this is the way to the future. This is the conversation about the future and what education is going to look like in the future. Let me offer, this doesn't seem like it's connected, but it is. Just be patient with me here. I am getting very frustrated with the conversations about AI in education because the conversation immediately goes to plagiarism. And this conversation is about so much more than punitive behavior. And then it's silly because people are using AI to catch AI. Like, that's so silly. But what is telling me, first of all, this conversation is about power. And it's about people who traditionally have had power that do not want to give up their power. And how you educate and who you educate and what you educate them about is a huge source of power. And so I see people in traditional settings clinging to that power when the conversation really needs to be about what is the learning model here. What are we really doing here? In part, my contribution to that conversation of rethinking what education is and what we're actually doing here. This is a meta conversation. This is a paradigm conversation. This isn't about specific techniques or ways like this is a paradigm shifting conversation. And that's what we should be having. And that's why we're talking about the learning landscape, and why we're taking time to understand where things are happening, because that's a huge indicator of why it's happening, for whom it is happening, um, and what is happening. Sorry about the background noise. Okay, I'm back. So the where matters. It matters. Before we get to the normative, which is what should be happening in these learning environments, what people should be learning, we have to be clear about what is happening. And part of what is happening is where it is happening. And we also have to be committed to educating. Like, we have to be interested in educating everybody, and we're not interested in educating everyone. We're just not, and we have to be really, really honest about that. But if we look in the spaces where we have not normally looked, we can see that there's some amazing things happening there. I encourage you to look in those spaces. Gig apps is an important space to look in, to see who's thriving there, who's doing it, what information is being disseminated to them, what knowledge is being shared with them in spaces. And think about what knowledge you could share in those spaces. Let's look at the whole thing. Let's see everything. And let me know if you want to talk more about this. All right.